Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to hot air balloons and ancient lunar colonies.
No one knows where, when, or how man first landed on the moon.
I do.
But, as always, we have to get there. This week's episode is dedicated to my daughter, in honor of her birthday, which is next week. I actually had to pay myself $180 for that dedication, but it was well worth it for the opportunity to support something I care about in honor of someone that I love. So if you'd like to dedicate an upcoming episode of the Parshah Rabbit Hole and help me to keep on digging, go to creativejudaism.com/donate. All right, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshah's Balak, tells us the story of how the Moabite king Balak hired a non-Jewish prophet named Balaam to curse the Jews. And it didn't work because God didn't want it to, and Balaam is instead compelled to bless the Jews, and then he goes home. And in the Parsha, that seems to be the end of his story. And then it moves on to an episode in which the Moabites and the Midianites entice the Jews into doing some really bad stuff. But a little bit later on in Parshas Matos, we hear about a war that God commanded the Jews to wage in response to this event. And there, Balaam is mentioned as having instigated that event, and is counted among the enemies that the Jews fought. It also tells us that the army carried with them klei hakodesh, holy objects. And Rashi tells us that these holy objects were actually used in the fight. He says that the holy objects referred to here are specifically the Aron, the Ark, which is the box that the tablets were in.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments.
And the tzitz, which is a golden headband thingy that was worn by the Kohen Gadol, and it had the name of God engraved on it. Now, Rashi doesn't tell us how the Ark came into play, but he does tell us how the tzitz did. Based on a midrash, he says that Balaam was with the kings of Midian, and he used his sorcery to make them fly through the air, and he flew along with them. But when the Jews showed them the tzitz with the name of Hashem engraved upon it, they all fell to the ground. So this is something that is a huge part of how I think about the whole Balaam story, even though it's not even really a part of the story as it's told in this week's Parsha, where generally he's pretty boring. There's a lot of talking. He's asked to curse, and then he doesn't curse, and then he blesses, and he doesn't really do much dramatic, epic stuff. And then eventually he's forced by God to say some really nice stuff, and then he just goes away. But if you piece it together with these added details from Midrash, that story actually ends with a magical aerial battle. So I decided to take this idea of people flying and use it as a starting point to explore aeronautics in Torah. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with the idea of human flight and aircrafts, and how that pops up in unexpected places. If you're ready to see where that goes, let's dive in. Okay, so we're going to start with flying camels. I've mentioned it a couple of times already in previous episodes, and now we finally have the chance to really get into it.
Let's look at the flying camel. First of all, a little theory.
The term gamla parcha, or flying camel, is used a few times in the Talmud as a possible mechanism for traversing long distances in an otherwise impossibly short amount of time. For example, the Gemara discusses a case in which two people claim to have witnessed a murder on Sunday morning in the city of Surah, and then two other people come and say that they were with those first two witnesses on Sunday evening in the city of Neharda. Now, according to the results I got by plugging some coordinates into some website, those two cities are about 125 miles apart. So the Gemara continues that according to Rava, the court does the math and figures out if that timing would work out, and if not, then those witnesses are considered to be fraudulent.
I can't be two places at once, right?
Then the Gemara asks, hey, isn't that obvious? Like, it seems like an obvious thing that if there seems to be a contradictory testimony based on anomalous location information, you would do the math and figure it out. And the Gemara answers that Rava is trying to tell us that just in case you might think we should consider the possibility that they used a flying camel, that's why we went into detail about the process of doing the math based on normal means of travel. Okay, so the first question is, are we talking about actual flying camels? Rashi says flying camels means a particular type of camel that's extremely fast, like a bird that flies. So it seems like the word flying is being used figuratively. I did see some places that reference sources where flying camels seem to be mentioned in a literal sense, but I couldn't track down the original sources for that. But in the case of that Gemara that we just looked at, it doesn't really matter if it actually existed or not, because the whole point of it is that it's something that's so improbable that we don't consider it as a possibility. But there's another Gemara that looks at the flying camels a little bit differently. It's discussing a case where someone found a get, a Jewish divorce document, in the city of Surah, signed by some guy, Anan Bar Chia, and it was notarized, so to speak, as having been signed in that city in Surah. Now, the Gemara doesn't explain this, but it seems like the guy, Anan Bar Chia, claims this isn't his. And if not, and he didn't intend to divorce his wife, then finding a divorce document would end up being a huge headache for him. Because now he and his wife aren't married anymore, and now they have to deal with that whole mess. What the Gemara does say is that the court searched for any other Anan Bar Chia, and they found one, but there were witnesses that said that the second Anan Bar Chia was in the city of Neharda on the day that that divorce document was signed in Surah. So Rava says he doesn't have to worry about it. We can assume that it might be the other Anan Bar Chia, and that he traveled from one city to the other so fast using one of three methods. The first is the flying camel. The second is kfitza, which is some sort of miraculous way to shorten long distances. I've used the word teleportation for this in a previous rabbit hole. And the last option is that he sent a messenger and did it remotely. Whatever the method, it adds some doubt and makes this document not apply to Anan Bar Chia, and the whole thing, I guess, just goes away. So first of all, I like that list. Flying camel, teleportation, or messenger. But what's relevant here is that in this case, the flying camel is considered a real possibility, not just a theoretical possibility that's discounted because of its improbability. Tosfos talks about this, but they don't address whether or not the flying camels are real. Their problem is why Rava seems to think it's probable enough to consider in one case, but not in another. So the answer that they propose is that in the case of the get, the divorce document, this second guy, the second Anan Bar Chia, is trying to sabotage some other guy's marriage, so he'd be motivated to use a flying camel. But in the murder witness's case, they only make their own testimony less believable if they used a flying camel. So therefore, we don't think that they would have been motivated to do that. So a couple of things about this. First of all, this idea that the second Anan Bar Chia is purposely trying to mess with this other guy's marriage. I don't know if he's just taking advantage of the fact that he has the same name as some other guy, and he just found out, he looked in the yellow pages, he's like, I bet I could sign documents in this guy's name. Or maybe it just so happens that he actually hates the first Anan Bar Chia. Whatever it is, it's funny that he's using the fact that they have the same name to go sign documents in his name. And then, the other thing that's funny about it is that he'd be so excited about messing up this guy's marriage with fraudulent paperwork that he would employ the use of a supernatural ungulate. But also, the whole logic of this is interesting to me. That if someone has a plan to hurt someone else, then they'll pull out all the stops. But I have a problem with the part about the murder witnesses. So yeah, giving a testimony with anomalous location information messes up your story. So why complicate things by flying around on a flying camel and making your story sound made up? But that logic only works if you're planning on witnessing a murder, which would be weird. But if you're just having a crazy night out, hopping around from city to city on your private flying camel, and towards the end of the night you happen to witness a murder, then there's nothing you can do about it. Nobody plans their days based on what would sound most believable in a testimony.
5 minutes ahead of schedule. Right on schedule.
I didn't see anybody mention or answer this question. If you have any ideas, please put it in the comments. Okay, now moving past the flying camels to another instance of flying in Gemara. In a couple of different places, the Gemara references a weird idea when talking about Doeg, who was an advisor to Shaul HaMelech, or King Saul, and was an antagonist to David HaMelech, King David. But in Midrash and Gemara, we get a lot more detail about how he was originally a great Torah scholar. And one of the things that's mentioned about him is that he knew 300 halachic rulings about a migdal hapareach ba'avir, a tower that flies in the air. Now, the whole point of that example, in both places that it's mentioned, is to be impressive, because it's such an extremely strange or obscure thing to know so many laws about. But the Gemara doesn't explain what it is. What's a flying tower? Rashi offers a few possibilities. One is that it's the letter Lamed that kind of has a tower poking up out of the top that makes it taller than all the other letters. And then what the Gemara means is that Doeg could learn hundreds of laws just from the shape of that one letter when it's used in verses in the Torah. Another possibility he offers is that it could be Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, which didn't fly, but I guess since the intention of it was for it to reach the heavens, then it could be called a tower that flies in the air, I guess. I don't know what kind of laws can be derived from the Tower of Babel, but I guess that's the point, that it would be impressive if someone could. Then Rashi says that in his opinion, it's talking about a type of freestanding wooden closet or cabinet that's placed at the entrance to another space, which is discussed in a Mishnah about Tumas oil, the ritual impurity that's transferred through being in the same physical space, like a room or a courtyard. So as far as I understand it, which is barely, the way this flying tower is being used here is as a space that's kind of its own space, but also kind of part of a larger space. So exploring it would help define the parameters of those laws. That third answer, the one that Rashi likes, seems to be the most widely accepted one. And even though it's the most normal and, dare I say, boring, I like it when the Talmud engineers very specific scenarios to test the limits of a legal concept. But according to Yad Rama, even this seemingly boring version requires an exciting twist. He seems to be of the opinion that, yeah, it's talking about the laws of transmitting ritual impurity through a shared physical space, but this wooden cabinet isn't just freestanding, it's floating, which seems to me like a way of literally air gapping this cabinet so that it's even more of an independent space within this larger space. But he says the only way for that to happen would be through using a miracle, or by using divine names, or by using magnets. So according to this, the tower that flies through the air is a wooden cabinet that floats miraculously, or through Kabbalah magic, or through magnetic levitation. But the Ben Ish Chai doesn't like this answer. He doesn't explain what the issue would be with the magnetic levitation and why he doesn't accept that. But with regard to the other options, he says that Jewish law wouldn't go into such detail about cases that could only be achieved through supernatural means. Instead, he starts talking about a technology that existed in his time, which he says is called Merkab al-Hwa, which in Arabic means something like air vehicle. Now, I can't say for sure exactly what technology he's talking about. He lived from 1835 to 1909, and the Wright brothers' first flight was in 1903, so maybe he could be talking about an airplane? But it seems more likely to me that he's talking about some sort of dirigible or airship. The first powered and steerable airship was built and flown in 1852, and then the technology continued to grow from there. So it seems like the Ben Ish Chai is talking about an airship, and he says that even though this technology had been innovated in recent times, he says that early Torah scholars definitely had access to this technology, even before the times of Doeg, and possibly all the way through the time of the Mishnah. But then this knowledge was lost and eventually re-innovated by the scholars of Europe. So according to this, the tower that flies through the air is a blimp.
Hey there, blimpy boy, flying through the sky so fancy-free.
But the most exciting revelation here is the idea that ancient Torah scholars already had aeronautic technology 2,000 years before it was officially invented, which is very cool. So when I found that, I was stuck for a long time on the Arabic. Fortunately, I have very smart friends who were eventually able to help me out with that. But before they did, I tried digging around for anything on the internet where somebody discusses that to see if I could try and piece it together and get some insight. And while I was digging around, I found a forum thread discussing another fascinating thing from the Ben Ish Chai, which maybe I'll get into in a future rabbit hole. And then someone on that thread mentioned this thing about airships, and in response to that, someone posted a link without any explanation. So I clicked on it, of course, and whoa. It's a commentary from Yonason Abeshitz, and maybe you've heard about it before, but I hadn't, and I thought it was extremely cool. It's about Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, which was built several generations after the flood. In Chumash, it doesn't say exactly what their plan was, just that they wanted to make a name for themselves to protect them from being scattered all over the face of the earth. According to Yonason Abeshitz, their goal was to get above the rain clouds so that they would be safe if God ever chose to flood the earth again. Then he starts talking about flying machines, and he says that the nature of wind is to blow upward. So, presumably, a flying apparatus should just get carried up higher and higher. But, he says, the air gets very thick and heavy up there and pushes the flying machine back down to earth.
Upside down world.
Ernie, I don't feel too good. Whee!
Now, I just want to note that this was written sometime in the early 1700s, so there were no actual flying machines yet. So this is all theoretical for him. Anyways, he goes on and says that if you could get a flying machine above this thick air, then it would be possible to go higher and higher until it even reached the moon. And he says that there are books that have been written about how to construct a ship like this. If anybody has any ideas which books this might be, please put it in the comments. Then he explains that this is what the people who built the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, were trying to do. They wanted to establish a moon colony where they'd be safe from any future floods. But how do they get past that thick air? And that's what the tower was for, to get them higher than the thick, heavy air, and then from there they could launch a ship to fly to the moon and colonize it. So, yeah, very cool. Ancient spaceships and moon colonies.
Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon?
Technically, maybe even prehistoric spaceships and moon colonies. So that's very, very exciting to me. Okay, so there's one more thing about the topic of flying that I actually discovered years ago, and it's one of my favorite things in Hasidus, or Jewish mysticism. It's from the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, and he's addressing the idea that humanity has gotten progressively more knowledgeable throughout time, as is clearly evident from all the secular knowledge, the math and science and stuff that has been developed throughout history, that the generations before it was invented couldn't understand. And the conclusion one could draw from this is that if you go back through time, people are more and more foolish, or at least ignorant. And he says that that conclusion is completely wrong. Yes, it's true, he says, that the scholars of the world have gained a lot of knowledge compared to those who preceded them, but that doesn't mean that ancient people were foolish. In fact, they were actually even more knowledgeable, just in different things. Because all of the knowledge of current smart people is focused on the physical world, like military technology. And he gives two examples. Eish mislat kachas, which is a term borrowed from verses in Torah, but here it seems like it's talking about some sort of advancement in artillery or explosives. Maybe it's grenades or something. I'm not sure. This really isn't my thing. Military history, I have no idea. I know nothing about it. If any of you out there are military history buffs and think you might know what that means, please let us know in the comments. Anyways, then he gives a second example, Sfina Pairachas Ba'avir, a ship that flies in the air. Now, the Alter Rebbe passed away in 1812, so this is before airships. But hot air balloons were developed in the 1700s, and I looked it up, and they were indeed used for military applications during that time. So it seems like the ship that flies through the air here is a hot air balloon.
The next part of the race,
announced the referee,
is balloons to the moon.
So the Alter Rebbe is mentioning this as an example of advanced modern technology that shows that the scientists of the time had a great understanding of the physical world and how to manipulate it. But, he continues, the earlier generations had an understanding of how the world worked spiritually. And the example he gives is the magicians of Egypt, who were the scholars of Egypt. And they knew how to turn a stick into a snake. And he gives another example of Balaam, who knew how to perform magic and use incantations. And this, he says, not even the greatest modern scholar can do. So what I love about this is, first of all, it addresses something that has always bothered me. I find that people often talk about ancient people as if they were naive or ignorant, and that bugs me, because it doesn't make any sense. We have the same brains. And sometimes people try to make it sound a little bit better and say, oh, it's not their fault. They may have had the capacity to understand it, but we needed to accumulate knowledge and build one idea on top of another first before we could get to all of the new things that were developed and invented. But that doesn't work for me, because there are some ideas that seem like they really don't need to build on previous things. It's just a flash that someone had one day. Like, why did it take until the 17th century for people to figure out that, hey, maybe we should actually try to control science experiments? Maybe that'd be a good idea. So the reason why I like this answer is because it does something that Hasidus does in a lot of places. It splits the whole thing into two and says, yeah, we've been getting smarter in one way, but less smart in another way. So I always love it when Hasidus pulls that trick of splitting an idea into two. But in this case, I particularly like it because it gives us a way to appreciate what we have that people before us didn't, but at the same time understand that we have our own blind spots. And also, it presents the possibility that maybe looking at things in a way that might seem outdated or even obsolete could actually give us insight into the world that we wouldn't otherwise be able to understand. All right, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, questions, things I missed, put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. Feel free to use our complimentary airship to get back up to the surface.